Okay, welcome everybody. We will give it just a minute more to make sure everybody who's in the waiting room is now in the Zoom room. Okay, so I think there are the last few people who are filtering in from the Zoom room over to the main room, and then we can get started with today's seminar. Okay, great. Yeah, I think I see the numbers stabilizing a little, so we can get started. Welcome everybody to another paleoecological seminar. Today we have Abraham Dabengwa speaking from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, and he will be talking to us about examining resilience and long-term rangeland health using multiple-proxy paleoecological methods and examples from the South African grassland. Before we get started, a quick summary of today's seminar, or the format for today's seminar. We will start by a few welcome and announcements, followed by Abraham's talk, which will be around 30 minutes. And we will have a moderated question and answers at the end of the talk for about 10 minutes. And Abraham has agreed to stay for tea time, which will be an informal chat after the talk for about 30 minutes. And we highly encourage everybody attending to stay for tea time. And as always, don't forget to send your questions via chat to the Questions paleoecological host, who today is going to be Chrissy. And a little bit of housekeeping. paleoecological values the participation of all folks interested in the paleosciences. Please remember to abide by our code of conduct during today's seminar. And please mute yourself. If you find yourself to be unmuted, please mute yourself for the duration of the talk, so there is minimum disturbance while Abraham is giving his talk. You can ask questions by chatting to the questions at paleoecological host, who today is Chrissy, or by raising the hand function, which is now available on Zoom. Any technical issues that you come across during the seminar should also go to the questions at paleoecological host. We now have closed captions built into Zoom, so you can use the CC button to show or hide them. And if you have or know any outstanding early career researcher, please nominate them for the paleoecological seminar series. You will find a link to do that in the Zoom chat right now. In addition to that, we will also add a link that gives us weekly feedback for demographic info. It is completely anonymous, optional, and highly encouraged. You can find those links in the chat window. And a little bit about today's speaker. Abraham did his bachelor's in science, focusing on forest resources and wildlife management from the National University of Science and Technology in Zimbabwe. He then did a master's of science in resource conservation biology from the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa, and recently completed a PhD in ecology from the University of Cape Town in South Africa. And currently, Abraham is an ecology researcher at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. We are very excited to have you, Abraham, and with that, feel free to share your screen and start the seminar.
Cool, thank you. Let me share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes, yeah, we can see your screen, and I think we'll have to change it to the slideshow view.
Slideshow mode, and just wait, I need to do the other thing again. Is it fine now?
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay, cool. Trying to get this. Okay, cool. Thanks for having me for this session of paleopecs. So I'll be talking about some work that I did for my PhD recent PhD a couple of years ago, which looks at the resilience of grasslands. And one of the things about resilience is like one of these concepts that imaging is important in ecosystem management, because it can be used to actually understand how an ecosystem loses its function, whether it loses that resilience that is purported to have, or in some cases, some loss of ecosystem functions can actually persist. And that's another actually example of resilience. So one of the things I like to talk about are grasslands. So grasslands are these ecosystems that are widespread, and they're very valuable landscapes all over the earth. They cover a large part of the earth. That's where you find watershed areas. Many of them are used as pastures. Some of them have been converted to forest and cropland. And these areas actually have got high grass and forb endemic diversity. And of course, these grasslands, some of them are in high-lying areas, and they're actually good for hiking and other recreational activities. And there's also been a realization that grasslands are also good carbon sinks because of their soils. But the big issue is that grasslands worldwide are degraded. As you can see, this is a global map of grasslands. And you can see that there's pretty much a lot of degradation happening in the grasslands. When I talk about degradation, I'm talking about the loss of ecosystem functioning, basically in terms of the services that the grasslands provide. Do they still provide them, or do they lose them? And when we talk about states, basically, the degraded states are those that are actually undesirable or unhealthy, that actually result in loss of ecosystem services. Oops. So one of the key drivers of degradation are the conversion of grassland to forest and agriculture. There's mining. There's of course unsustainable resource use and management, from crop and livestock. And livestock and wildlife management are those key intensive and extensive activities that alter biodiversity because of their adverse effects on soil and vegetation. And one of the key drivers that actually mismanaged in grasslands are actually fire. Fires are not used very well in many grasslands, and this is a key issue which affects biodiversity, soil, and a lot of the function that the grasslands provide. And one of the things is that herbivores are not just new in some landscapes, they've been there for much longer. And because of that, some landscapes may be perceived as degraded, whereas they are actually not degraded. So we're living in this period where we're in the decade of ecosystem restoration. The United Nations has decided that degradation is a bad phenomenon. We must do something about it. And 2021 to 2030 has been declared as the decade of restoration. And in this decade, a lot of activities are planned for actually restoring ecosystem functioning. But there's this long-held misconceptions that tree landscapes like forests are more valuable than intact open grasslands that are open ecosystems that are dominated by grasses. So key papers have been coming out highlighting this issue. There's, for instance, this one by Catherine Parr. There's this one by Joseph Feldman, who actually talks about how we should actually treat grasslands in the same sense that we treat forests, that actually grasslands are a valuable ecosystem that's ancient, not recent or degraded. And because of this, there's been a shift towards thinking about how to restore grasslands ecosystems, because if we're moving away of thinking of grasslands as degraded and grasslands as being important providers of ecosystem service, then we actually have to change the way we think about how to actually restore them. And of course, there's this paper by Fernando that talks about these key issues by actually bringing out those issues that actually raised about grasslands and showing that actually that grasslands are key ecosystems and they're valuable and they are ancient, and they should actually be treated in the same vein as we treat forests. So there's many other factors that, like I was saying, that actually affect our understanding of grasslands. One of the key issues, especially in grasslands, is this issue of the rangeland succession model, whereby we think of grasslands as primitive systems on their way to becoming forests. And in these systems, basically fire and grazing are considered negative disturbances, which prevent trees from actually coming to the fore. But of course, this has been shown to be wrong. And one of the reasons why is because these succession ideas actually failed to acknowledge that landscapes have got different histories of disturbances by fire and herbivores. And because of that, how we restore them should match the history. A reason why we have to think about restoration is that there are some states that are difficult to reverse, and they're historetic, because if for you to reverse the state, you have to restore some key processes that are actually important for maintaining that particular state. Rainfall is also another key driver, and also the spatial scale of observation. So an example of hysteresis here, for instance, here the green state is the desirable state and the red state is the undesirable state. So we can see that there are actually different pathways. It's not so easy to go back from the red to the green. It has to go through a different pathway. And another example is this, that actually, when you change the grassland, there are many different pathways that it has to go through to go back to that initial state. So because it takes a long time, some systems may persist in a degraded state for much longer than we expect. So there's this new alternative way of thinking about how grasslands function. And in this case, we think about grass biomass, the grass species, and the height of grass over spaces in time as being driven by either flammability traits. What do we mean by flammability traits? It's how grasses respond to fires. And some of them are flammable, others are less flammable. And in a flammable system, the system actually is driven by positive feedbacks. The flammable vegetation promotes itself over time, such that in some systems you get plants that are adapted to fires, whereas in others you get plants that are not adapted to fires. In the same vein, you also get some of the grass traits driven by palatability traits. In this case, because some grasses are more palatable to herbivores, they actually start increasing in abundance in the landscape. But at the same time, herbivores can actually shift a grassland community to unpalatable species by actually removing palatable species. And one other driver that's actually important is that in terms of these extremes from flammability to palatability, there's actually a rainfall gradient, with palatability traits usually associated with lower rainfall and the flammability associated with higher rainfall areas. So if we think about the two extremes, basically where you've got very short grass and where you've got tall grasses, what's happening here is whether an area is likely to be grazed or likely to be burned. So as you can see, taller grasses with more biomass are more likely to burn because they can get to a state where they are less palatable to herbivores. And with herbivores grazing, it promotes grasses that are actually quite short and that can actually tolerate that grazing, frequent grazing. And here we come back to what I was talking about, the two different drivers of grass community dynamics. So these basically are the alternative states, basically either you're moving towards flammability or palatability. And when you think about in terms of C4 grasses, in the two plates, basically the chloridoideae are usually the ones that are associated with the short grasses, whereas the panicoideae subfamily has the one that has got most of the tall grasses, which actually burn. And one of the things that we know about taller plants is that they actually have to put in more biomass. And with more biomass, it means that there's more carbon compared to nitrogen. So basically, the more carbon they have, the less palatable they become. So we can actually see that actually that palatability, flammability gradient can actually be inferred from the CN ratio. And like I said here, we've got these extremes from short grass to tall grasses. And so pastoralism in Africa is not new. So when we talk about degradation, we have to think about it from a long-term perspective, because there's evidence that livestock has been kept more than 1,500 years. When I'm talking about Southern Africa. But actually, Southern Africa is the last place in Africa to have pastoralism. And interestingly, in the last, for South Africa, in the last 1,000 years, there's been an influx of Nguni herders from East Africa. And they are known for keeping large livestock herds. And as you can see, we expect some changes in vegetation dynamics and ecosystem dynamics with the arrival of these people. It's either they've changed fire patterns, they've changed, they've displaced the indigenous herbivores that used to persist, or we might suspect that they use the landscape differently. So one way to actually think about how we can think about pastoralists as agents of change is that we actually have to profile them and think about what they actually do. So one of the things is that they don't use the landscapes evenly. Some areas are much preferred over others. And most of the areas which are preferred have got more foraging resources. But sometimes the areas without foraging resources can actually be increased by actually having water, like having more access to water, or actually by burning grasses, which actually increases the resource potential of landscapes. And then there's this idea that the areas that actually retain water and are productive, they're actually able to support a lot of herbivore biomass. And these areas are actually termed key resource areas. Also, areas near homesteads are used frequently. And one of the things that key resource areas are likely to be susceptible to degradation, or they could actually drive degradation in the wider landscapes because they can support high herbivore biomass and densities. So this is one of the key areas that we actually have to think about when we think about how we actually analyze these dynamics. And because wetland grasslands, which you find in sedimentary environments, they're examples of these key resource areas. And there's literature that suggests that these wetland grasslands are quite resilient. So these are hypothetical landscapes, basically with key resource areas. So some landscapes have got fewer key resource areas than others. But landscapes can be degraded. Landscapes with fewer key resource areas can be degraded because the key resource areas may be stressed. But landscapes with more key resource areas are likely to lead to wider degradation in the wider landscapes. So there's this trade-off. But at the same time, there's this theory that actually key resource areas are resilient. And I want us to think about resilience in terms of the ability to persist in the face of disturbance without transitioning to another state. And in this case, we're thinking about a healthy and a degraded state. And because resilience, depending on the resilience of a landscape, it actually affects how they can actually be restored. So for example, here, we can have a healthy and unhealthy state. For instance, in a healthy state, we can have a lot of foraging resources. In an unhealthy state, you've got the opposite. A healthy state, you can have palatable species. we can have higher species diversity, we can have tolerable disturbance regimes, whereas we might get the opposite in the degraded states. And one of the ways that we can start probing resilience and ecosystem health is to actually look at long-term records, because long-term records have got three properties. One, they are actually long enough to actually pick up persistent ecosystem states, and we can find out what actually drives those ecosystem states. And at the same time, we can actually know where these states are happening in terms of like the spatial aspects. And when we look further, we actually have to consider that alternative ecosystem states are driven by positive feedbacks. Therefore, if a system is degraded, it's likely to remain degraded. Whereas if it's healthy, it's likely to remain healthy. Those factors that keep it healthy are likely to persist. And then there's also this another alternative state whereby we think about tall versus short grasses. So we can look at these different alternate ecosystem states with using long-term records. And the key thing about long-term records, especially the sedimentary ones, are that they are spatially constrained. And because of that, we can make conclusions regarding ecosystem states and processes. And from these, we can actually find baseline states for restoration. Okay. So one of the key proxies that are actually useful, especially for grasses, are grass phytoliths. So grass phytoliths are these opaline microscopic structures made of silica, and they're found in some plant tissues, and they persist for a long time after plants die. And then some of these phytoliths are found in grass leaves are very taxonomically distinct, and they can actually be used to diagnose the subfamilies of grasses. For instance, here in this screen, you've got, you can see different, do I have a pointer? Okay. We can see different types of phytoliths, and these are associated with different phytolith types that different associated with different subfamilies. And these can actually be used to find out which of the grasses or the grass community is C4, uses C4 photosynthesis, or uses C3. Usually the C3 grasses in most landscapes are found near the wetlands, on the wetland fringe, but also in the higher lying areas, and also some areas in the drier areas. And at the same time, you can also use this knowledge, for instance, to see the contrast between the tall panicoid grasses and the short chloridoidea grasses using phytoliths. And here we can see the different photosynthetic pathways that are used by the different grass subfamilies or clades. And so we can actually combine phytoliths with other proxies, like fossil dung fungal spores, like Sporomyella, which are found in herbivore dung, which collects near the wetland sedimentary environments, can be used to infer grazing pressure or herbivore densities or biomass. And at the same time, microscopic charcoal or charcoal per se can be used to actually reconstruct fire history. So we expect that the more charcoal there is, we're leaning towards the panicoid tall grasses, and the less charcoal there is, we're leaning towards the chloridoid short grasses. So let's look at an example from Southern Africa. So this is our paper that like outlines, that summarizes the study that I'm just gonna give. But today I'm just gonna go in a bit in depth compared to what we outlined here because of word limitations. So this study was done in Blood River Vlei, in South Africa. So this site is found in a grassland, and it's basically at 1,200 meters. It's definitely highland, but not too high. So it can, oh, something is happening. Okay. And it's a relatively wet area. And there's evidence of wetland burning that we found. And in this wider ecosystem, fire is considered the predominant consumer of grass biomass. So we collected a 134 centimeter sedimentary core, which represents an approximately 1,250 year record. So we had a couple of key research questions. So we wanted to find out how has wetland grassland vegetation changed in the last 1,250 years. So in this case, the wetland grassland, in this case, is our key resource area. And then we wanted to find out what are the roles of grazing and fire in driving the observed grass dynamics. And wanted to find out if there's evidence of rangeland degradation or resilience. And lastly, wanted to know the implications of this study on informing grassland restoration. So the first question. So here we've got, this is the percentage of the grass phytoliths, the subfamilies here. So what we can see here is that there are 3 different grass communities that could be seen from the past at the bottom to the present at the top. We've got Phi 1 to Phi 3. What is clear here is that you notice that Aristoideae appear from 650 to about 320 years ago. So this is one of the interesting things, that Aristotle is not very present, it just briefly appears. But what we see here is an increase over time in Arundinoideae and Poideae, especially the Poideae, which are C3 grasses. So the C3 grasses are the ones that you usually find close to the wetland, whereas the C4 grasses, although they are near the wetland, but they are more likely to be found in the landscape, and it will give an indication about what is happening in the landscape. And we can see here that generally from the loss on ignition, soil organic material increased over time. And here we can see, okay, this is the dry. So there was this dry climatic period from here that I'm just going to highlight. And you can see it's happening between Phi 2, zone Phi 2 and zone Phi 3. And we're using this record from Chevalier and Chase. Okay. So when we do the ordination of the grass phytolith subfamilies, we see that they are actually distinctive. They're actually distinctive zones. Phi 1 and Phi 3 are quite distinctive zones, whereas zone Phi 2 does potentially cover, it intersects with most of the with these 2 states. And also what we notice that Chloridoideae, zone Phi 1, Chloridoideae is where Chloridoideae is centered, and whereas Arundinoideae, which is Phragmites, is nearer to the zone Phi 3. So that's actually quite interesting. And so we wanted to find out what are the roles of grazing and fire in driving these observed grass dynamics. So when you look at the dung spore record, so I'd like you to focus on Sporomyla, which is the, how do I get this? I want a pointer. Okay, when we focus on Sporomyla, this one on the extreme left, we can see that it doesn't seem to be much Sporomyla at the beginning, but Sporomyla starts increasing over time and starts decreasing later. And we also look at Conychiata lignaria, which seems to increase over time. So Sporomyla is mostly the one that's related to herbivore biomass and grazing pressure, whereas Conychiata lignaria, the second one, is mostly related to local wetland moisture. And we can see that although rainfall changes over time, wetland moisture seems to increase over time. So that's actually an interesting observation. So when you do the ordination of the dung fungal spores, we see that Sporomyla and Conychiata, the one I'd highlighted, they split separately. So we see that on this side, basically on the negative, where there's on the primary axis, where there's negative, there's where sporomyela and the other key dung fungal spores that are related to herbivory, like Cercophora, Chaetomium, and Delicia, and Glomus are found. So that's quite interesting. Whereas Connecta lignaria seems to be clustering closer to Podospora. I don't know what's happening there, but we'll see. So what you can see here basically is that there's generally an increase of grass biomass because we expect wetness, like because when it's much wetter, there should be more grass biomass. And as expected here, we see that there's actually a reduction, a decrease in grass biomass with herbivore density as we are inferring from sporomyela. When you look at fire history from charcoal, we see that in the zone phi 1, which is the earliest period, there was relatively little charcoal, but charcoal started increasing in zone phi 2 when we can see that it was getting much drier, and also somewhat increased in zone phi 3. But the interesting thing about zone phi 3, we can see that from 240 BP, there seemed to be a relationship between charcoal and rainfall amount. And so when we ordinate the charcoal particle sizes, we see that charcoal particle sizes are smaller in older and recent phytolith zones. And there's definitely more charcoal particles in the zone associated with more fire. And we can see from the ordination that there's a strong positive relationship between grass biomass, plant size, and fire frequency, although there's a bit of leeway, but we can kind of like see that this is the general direction on that gradient of how grass biomass, plant size, and fire frequency change. When we consider fire and herbivory, both of them happening in time, and we're assuming that they are both consumers of grass biomass, we see that they act differently. When we consider macro charcoal, which is a local signal, and sporomyela, but when you look at the ordination, at the signal from the ordination, we see that actually the signal from the ordination shows that actually fire and herbivory signals are much more stronger than you get when you just look at macro charcoal or sporomyela on their own. And so these shaded portions are where it was a bit drier. And I think I've already explained this. And we expect, so one of the things that we expect here is that actually when there was this big increase in fire and herbivory, we assume that maybe that is when the pastoralists, the Nguni pastoralists arrived in the area. And so when you see that when you ordinate the signals for herbivory and fire, we see that we can still pick up those two alternative stable states that we had found, that zone phi 1 and phi 3 are different. And we can actually see it from here, even from the profiles of fire and herbivory, that they are indeed different. And that zone phi 2 overlaps pretty much with all of them. And so when you look at the CN ratios, basically what we do find is that it's not, we didn't get a negative relationship that we expect, you know, because we expect that the more herbivores there are, there'll be the grass, they'll actually reduce grass size, and reduction of grass size means that there's less carbon, and less carbon basically will kind of like change the ratio. We don't really have that nice negative relationship here. But when we look at flammability, like in terms of CN ratio with the charcoal NMS DS1, the ordination, we see that there is a clear positive relationship that we expect, that as you increase in biomass, you increase in CN ratio, which means that you increase in fire. And so the question is there evidence of degradation or resilience? So for us to do this, we have to think about what has happened here. So zone phi 1, this is how the system has progressed, basically from a palatable short grass system. And then we suspect that pastoralists moved in, intensified land use by increasing fires. And as they increased fires, basically they started increasing unpalatable phragmites, which doesn't burn, or even when it burns, it recovers quickly. So, and what has happened is that there's been a change in terms of the system moving from a more palatable state to a more flammable state. So what we see here is that, like, we can consider that the first state from 1250 to 690 cal BP was a healthy state maintained by herbivores. And this state was able to sustain heavy grazing, like a high herbivore pressure. Whereas from 690 to 410, we can see a transitional state where there was like high fire and high herbivory. And this was actually driven by drought, fire, and overgrazing. And we can see that this state is not really resilient, as we could see that there was actually overlap between this and the other two states. And then we've got what I classify as a degraded state. In this case, I'm thinking about it in terms of value for foraging, that actually the last stage is not very valuable for foraging because it's got more phragmites. Phragmites has to be burnt a lot for it to be palatable to herbivores. But it can resist fire and grazing for a long period. So what are the implications of these findings for grassland restoration? So one of the things that we've learned here is that, although fire is the dominant consumer in the present landscapes, this has not always been the case. Herbivores were likely key in this system. So the loss of herbivores was a big stress to the system. And by losing those herbivores, we started encouraging tall grasses to grow because of increasing fire. And then it seems like the livestock, which is like cattle, goats, and the like, were not as capable as the wild herbivores that persisted before. And here we also see that considering fire and herbivore as alternative states is useful, because we can see that in this sense, when you think about ecosystem health for this particular landscape, if we consider the past where there was actually short grasses, that was a good state maintained by herbivores. But for us to think about this landscape function for herbivores, in this case for pastoralists, it has actually lost its value because it's now having more fire, which actually means that there's less available food for herbivores, or actually less reliable food available for herbivores. And one of the things that we see is that there's mismanagement of fire and grazing are one of the key factors that reduce forage quality. This can actually happen from short timescales, like Tavares et al. Showed in a core in Namibia for the last 200 years. But here we're showing, even in the much longer record, that actually mismanagement can persist for a long, long time. And there's this trade-off in ecosystem services, because a short grass system which supports grazers doesn't actually keep much grass biomass. And the more grass biomass you have, you can store more carbon, you can stabilize soil, and you can keep more water in the system. So we also need to think about this. And then we also see that there's changes that we see suggest that there's hysteresis, because it's not going to be easy to move from phi 1, the short grass state, to the tall grass state with phragmites without introducing herbivores that can actually take care of that process. And although grasslands support natural biodiversity, but they're actually important for people, especially in Africa, where a lot of people depend on the land. And so, when we think about restoration, we should think about how much land we should actually make available for people, especially indigenous communities and people who actually need access to these resources. Because remember, the more key resource areas they have, or the more wider landscape resources they have, that trade-off can actually be important for them in either in sustaining their livestock densities, but also in maintaining some of the ecosystem processes that happen in grasslands. And of course, we can see that a long-term perspective is actually quite useful for guiding evidence-based restoration and future grassland management. Because without paleoecological data, we can only just be guessing, because we could just say tall grasslands are driven by fire, but have they always been that way? So there's actually unique histories for each landscape. So we can see that actually paleoecological records play a very key role here. Of course, there are limitations to the study that I've just presented here, because the functional approach that I looked at by considering grass subfamilies ignores the role of individual species and genera. And if we had that information, we could start analyzing fire and herbivore-driven grass community traits at a more specific level, because here it was just like an overview, a generalized picture. Another limitation that, like, for this particular study, I just only considered the grass layer, but we know that in rangelands there are trees and grasses. But one of the key reasons here is that in wetland grasslands, grasses are the dominant growth form. So, and also because of that, because of the partial extent that I'm considering, this could actually pass. And then also at the same time, we have limited information about herbivore taxonomy. And this actually influences the type of grazing regimes and the type of vegetation that you have, the amount of soil impact that could be generated, and also the dispersal abilities of some species nearby. So in this case, sedimentary ancient DNA that can actually give us information about herbivore profiles will be quite useful. So these are the list of references for those who usually care to read. I'll just gloss over them. And yeah, I'll just like to say thank you very much for paying attention. And I'd like to thank a lot of people who made this work possible. There was a lovely field team that I had, my supervisors, Lindsay Gilson and William Bond, and also my current host at WITS, Sally Archibald. Yeah, so these are the different organizations that that made this work possible. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much for paying attention.
Yeah, thank you so much, Abraham, for the wonderful talk on the resilience of grasslands in South Africa. I would again just like to remind everyone, if you have questions, feel free to drop them in the chat or send them to the questions at paleoperks, who today is Chrissy. And I have some questions that are already coming in, and I'm going to drop them in the chat as well. So thank you for this really interesting talk. You should have figured, briefly looking at changes between the different ecosystem states, that there was some variability between those. Do you think that there were some more frequent shifts or intermediate states that could be present and quasi-stable?
Yeah, I think let me just go to the slide just to answer. So here we are. So yeah, so like while the short grass state would, the earlier short grass state and the later one I would consider stable, the intermediate one is quasi-stable because it's somehow driven by different forces, like there's something driving, there's fire driving that system, but because people actually, we suspect that humans actually lighting these fires to promote grazing, that actually this is an unstable, it's quite unstable, it's really unstable because people actually driving that, the coupling between like fire and herbivory. So in this sense, I think that it's not really stable, this state. I don't know whether it answers your question.
Yeah, I think it does. Yeah. Thank you for answering that. There's another one that's come, and I will also drop that in the chat. Are there places that you're able to get soil or sediment cores to reconstruct plant communities deeper in time from what you showed?
Well, like this is one side. Like I had other sites where I've reconstructed herbivores. Well, I mean, it depends what you mean deeper in time. So one of the things that we have limitations because most of the sediments that we can get are just late Holocene because of the landscapes that we have in Africa, because of frequent drought, and also some of the landscapes have been trashed, and also some of them actually used by herbivores. So it's difficult to get a good enough core which is intact to actually have like that deeper like time. I mean, I don't know understand what you mean by deeper time. Do you mean like Holocene or pre-Holocene or something like that?
I guess, yeah, how far back can you go? Can you go pre-Holocene?
Well, like the deposits I worked on were late Holocene in the last 2,000 years. But at the moment, I might be working on things that are like the last 200,000 years. So so I haven't looked at those samples yet. So I cannot comment because there's not much work that's been done, like combining phytoliths, dung fungal spores, and charcoal at that deeper in time. So that's what I'm be trying to do next.
Okay. Yep. Another question is, how do areas that are closer to large populations of humans differ from less populated areas? Do you think that these patterns are more due to climate, that is precipitation, or human influence?
It's a bit difficult to say because like each landscape is unique. So, for instance, some communities, some societies had livestock that they keep close, whereas others, the livestock they range for much like in much wider areas. Like so, one of the things that we can actually see, we can try and infer is that like areas where there's more coupling between fire and grazing, you would expect to have a closer human population settlement compared to those that don't have. But this is just hypothetical. No studies have been done to show this.
Okay. Yeah, and something similar, maybe you already touched on, is what do you see as the next steps for this work? And I think you were quickly mentioning the cores that are pre-Holocene that you might be looking into.
Okay, cool. So I mean, the next step for this work, obviously, is like is synthesizing records, like grassland records from this region, because it's just one record, but the whole there's a range like which has got about 12 in total, about 12 records. So one of the interesting things, because we know that pastoralism arrived late in Southern Africa, and it arrived late at the higher elevation areas. One of the ways will be actually to pick up how we can pick up this changing signal, and to actually see how it actually translates in terms of the changing that, because one of the things like there's still a jury out. We've got very poor representation of charcoal from grasslands, and also the dung fungal spore records that we actually get from grasslands, they're very sparse, and so it shows that there are actually other things going on. So putting this record in context of other records will be important for us to actually start mapping like past human activities, how they actually modified ecosystems, and when we get that idea, then we can start charting the future of how to actually restore some of them, because we know some of them have been disturbed recently, whereas others may have been disturbed for much longer. So the question is, do we have a one-size-fits-all, or should we come up with more targeted approaches to restoration, especially when we can use like the valuable paleoecological archives that we actually have?
Okay, yeah. So a lot of more work to do, a lot of like exciting things that are already lined up. That's nice. Okay, I think I am going to share screen. There are no more questions. Yeah, okay. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. Please fill out the weekly feedback form. The link should be in the chat so that we can learn a bit more about who attended to the seminar. And next week, we will be back with a surprise speaker. So hopefully we'll see a lot of you there. And it's time for a break before tea time. I'm going to start a 2-minute timer and then see you in 2 minutes.